Hello, everyone. Welcome to Developmental Psychology, DEP 2004. I am Dr. Rivera. All right, everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the study designs that are used in development. I want to reiterate that developmental psychology is really a multidisciplinary field where there are a lot of studies done that are more biological in nature or sociocultural in nature. Um, but obviously, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the study designs that uh, are used by psychologists. So now, I always like to talk about naturalistic observations and case studies together because they're almost the opposites of each other. In a naturalistic observation, the research is done in the subject's natural environment. This is done specifically because when you bring anything into the lab, especially an animal or a person, it's going to act differently than when it's out in nature in its own environment where it feels safe and comfortable. Now, the natural environment is specifically what is the natural environment for that subject. And so for a chimp, like Jane Goodall went to study chimps, or a baboon, like Robert Sapolsky goes to study baboons, they have to go out in the wilderness where there are chimps in nature or where there are baboons in nature. But if you were going to study um, kids dealing with cancer, well, you can go to the middle of the wilderness, but that's really not where you're going to find these kids naturally. You're going to find them naturally probably at a hospital where they're getting their treatments, or maybe in their homes, or maybe in a center, something like that. So it's specifically the natural environment of the subject. Also, in a naturalistic observation, uh, you should not interfere. Um, that includes just about everything. You should not be interacting with the animals or the subjects. You can't ask questions. You can't do a survey because all of these things are things that would make you interfere with the subject. Now, you might notice that Jane Goodall there is very close to that chimp. And the truth is that she did this so often for so many years that over the years, the chimps just started coming to her. And she actually developed a pretty nice relationship with the chimps. In a normal naturalistic observation, you should not be interacting with the animals at all. Now, a case study is almost the exact opposite. In a case study, the subject comes to you, and usually the environment is wherever the researcher is, in their office or at the hospital. Why does this happen? Because usually that person is coming to you for help. You happen to be their therapist, or you happen to be their doctor, and they're asking you to fix them. Give me medication, give me therapy so that I can get better. As you do that, as you are interacting with them, giving them medication, giving them therapies, checking to see if the medications and therapies work, asking questions about how they got this thing that they got, you realize that what they have is quite unique. Because it's so unique, you wouldn't be able to find 100 people to do one study. And so, what you're going to do is you're going to take down all of their information, including where did they go, what did they eat. If it's something psychological, you might ask about their family life or their relationships or some traumatic experience they might have faced. And then you get their permission to publish uh, your research as a case study. Um, you can't tell someone who's coming to you as a patient or a client that you cannot treat them because you want to do research on them. That would be completely unethical. This person is coming to you for help. And that's your job to help them in these scenarios, at least. And so, in a case study, there is a lot of interaction and a lot of interference. Now, another way that they are very different from one another is that usually in a naturalistic observation, you have a normal sample. Usually, the sample is composed of the subjects that are part of that group that you're looking at. So if you go into the middle of the wilderness to find chimps, well, whatever chimps are part of that group, you're observing all of them. If you go to observe baboons, you're observing all those baboons. Also, you're probably not just going to look at one group. You might go into the jungle to look at one group of chimps for a few months. And then you break down your camp, go to a different part of the jungle, set it up, and then you're going to look at that group, at a second group of chimps for another 2 or 3 months. The sample size can actually be quite large because each group is going to have a certain amount of chimps, and you're also probably going to look at different groups of chimps as well. Let's say you decide to do a study on tailgating at sporting events. Well, you're going to go there and you're going to observe everyone that's there, quite possibly, or at least a subsection of the people that are there. In a case study, you usually only have one individual because it's that one individual that came to you. Now, there are situations, for example, if you are doing a study in industrial and organizational psychology, where you might be studying a business and your one sample is one store, but there are a lot of people in that one store that you're going to be observing and looking into. Well, in that case, you might have more people. It's still a case study because you're still interfering and looking to see what works or doesn't, looking at their finances. So you're interacting a lot with them. But it's still a case study because it's just one store in this scenario. Now, in a case study, you have the ability to give questionnaires or standardized tests because you get to interact with this person. In a naturalistic observation, you don't have that ability. In fact, in a naturalistic observation, researchers go to greater and greater lengths to not even be seen. It's not a requirement that you're not seen in a naturalistic observation, but if you're not, that helps out a lot. Some researchers will set up cameras um, in the distance or set it overnight so that they can look at any animal sort of walking by. In a case study, you don't have to do that. You could just go straight up to the person and say, hey, tell me about your family life. Tell me about where you went to vacation before you got this disease, whatever it might be. Now, a lot of research uh, uses correlation uh, in order to determine if two variables have any kind of relationship. Um, if you were to do a survey or even certain types of case studies or observational research, you could just do that research and report your findings, and that would be it. There's nothing, you're not taking any extra step. But usually, you're interested to see if there's any relationship. Maybe you're interested in how dieting affects weight gain. Well, if you just collect the data and you notice that some people went up in weight and other people didn't, that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. And yeah, technically speaking, you could just report that. Polls do that all the time. They just say, 25% of people said this and 30% of people said that. And that's it. They don't go any further. But you can go further, right? Sometimes in a poll, let's say a poll for in a political season, they might tell you um, 35% of white Americans said this, whereas 25% of African Americans said the same thing. And then you want to know, wait, so why? Why is that happening? how come more of one group and less of the other group? Well, then you sometimes will add another variable there to see if there is a relationship numbers. In a correlation, um, what you're trying to find out is, first of all, the strength of the correlation. And so you go from 0 to 1, 0 being no correlation at all, and 1 being a perfect correlation, meaning 100% of the time, when I see one variable do X, I'll see the other variable do X or Y, right? Um, they move together, not always for the same thing, but they always move together. It's very hard to have a correlation that is a perfect 1. Um, Nothing really works like that. Like, even if I tell you flu like symptoms are correlated with having the flu, and that makes perfect sense. That's why we call them flu like symptoms. But the truth is that that's not a perfect correlation. Sometimes you have flu like symptoms and you don't have the flu, you have something else. And sometimes you have the flu, but your body takes care of it quickly enough. And so you never get the flu like symptoms. And so, even in a situation like that where you would expect it to be close to perfect, it's never going to be perfect. Um, and in psychology, when our behaviors and our thought patterns are affected by so many variables, it's very unlikely that you're going to get a correlation of 1. Usually, a zero point 0.8 is going to be incredibly high in psychology. If you find something like that, oftentimes you're looking at multiple variables, and it tends to be something that affects almost everyone in the same way, uh, in order to get a correlation that high. Um, Now, another thing that you'll notice about correlations is their direction. So sometimes people will say that there is a positive correlation or a negative correlation. And this has nothing to do with being good or bad. Um, it is only talking about the direction of the relationship. I always like to show these arrows. If I were in front of you, I do this like thumbs up, right? So a positive correlation, both variables are going up or coming down together. So it doesn't matter if they're both going up or they're both going down. If they're both doing the same thing, it's a positive correlation. And here they give the example of time spent studying versus your grades in school. For the most part, this tends to be the case. The more you study, the higher your grade. And the less you study, the lower your grade. So that's a positive correlation. A negative correlation where one variable is going up, the other one is going down. Um, a classic example of this is the frequency of delinquent acts, or how often you get in trouble with the law, tends to have a negative correlation to your grades in school. It's usually the case that if you're the kind of student who has A's and B's, you're going to be the kind of student who rarely gets in trouble with the law. And if you happen to be a student who gets a lot of D's and F's, then your chances for being in trouble with the law increases. Now, that's not perfect. There are kids who do great in school and they're also delinquents. This is just a correlation, right? And there's probably some third variable that makes this happen, right? If you have parents who don't take care of their children, or um, maybe they work too much so that they don't have time to be there for their kids, well, then they're not there to help you out with your homework. And they're also not there to correct your behavior. And so it could be that parents are the third variable that actually affect both of these variables. We don't know, and we cannot know the answer to that question just by doing a correlation. The correlation only tells us that the relationship exists, not what causes it. Let me just hit here limitations. You always want to remember that correlations do not determine causation or causal effects, right? Just because two variables correlate does not mean that one variable caused the other. And the classic example is ice cream and crime rates. When ice cream sales go up, crime rates also go up. And when ice cream sales go down, crime rates also go down. And if you don't understand correlations, you might start to think that ice cream causes crime or that crime causes ice cream. But of course, that makes no sense. The truth is that these two variables are being affected by something else, some other, we usually call it a third variable. Another example of that is most car accidents occur within 10 miles of your house. And sometimes people will tell you things like the reason that happens is because people are more careless when they're closer to their home. And that's a possibility. But just as simply, it could also be that most people drive within 10 miles of their home. And so obviously you're going to have a car accident where you happen to be and we're mostly near our home. Um, and so it's not always clear what the third variable is that's causing that relationship, in this case, between mileage away from your house and frequency of car accidents. Um, Here's another example. Uh, Being smart tends to correlate with having a lot of friends. Now, we don't know why that happens, right? This is a correlation. And so, I mean, there's been research um, on topics like this forever, but in this specific scenario, we don't know what specifically is doing this. It could be that being smart causes you to have more friends, or it could be people with more friends tend to cause those friends to have uh, higher IQ. Maybe they want to impress their friends, and so they do a little bit better in school. Um, Maybe it's just the fact that people love you makes you want to succeed more in life, right? There could be other variables there. One of the possible third variables that they gave us here is parents who are warm and supportive tend to have children who are smart. And also, parents who are warm and supportive tend to have children who are good with their friends. Maybe this is the variable, parents is the variable that is causing um, intelligence in children and developing good friendships to correlate together. Now, if you're interested in whether or not variable A causes variable B to occur, you must do an experiment. Now, I understand that when you're talking with people just normally, experiment is used often to mean just any study. And so sometimes people will even say things like, oh, so and so did an experiment, it was a case study. And that's fine. People talk like that. But in science, an experiment is a specific type of study. It's a type of study where you control one variable to determine if that variable affects the second variable. Now, because we are controlling some of these variables, then we have to name them specifically. And I'm going to talk a little bit about independent variables and dependent variables and control groups and experimental groups. First of all, an experiment must have an independent variable. An independent variable is the variable that is being controlled or manipulated by the researcher. So if I'm doing research on how well a brand of sneakers affects ankle injuries, maybe let's say I work for Nike and I want to know, does Nike protect runners from ankle injury better than some of my other competition? Well, the independent variable here is going to be the brand name of the shoe. Maybe I'm going to give some people the Nike, and then uh, I'm going to give some other people Adidas or some other running shoes, Fila's. Okay. And then I'm going to run my experiments and I'm going to see if my independent variable, the shoe brand, affected the dependent variable, ankle injury. Therefore, my dependent variable is the variable that I am measuring at the end, right? So in this case, is going to be ankle injuries. Whatever I happen to be measuring and then comparing, that is going to be my dependent variable. Now, my independent variable, I want to go back to that, is usually going to be have two parts or two versions of it. It could have more than two, but minimum it has to have two because I need to put some people in a control group and I need to put some people in my experimental group. And my experimental group is the group that gets the manipulation, right? Let's say that what I'm interested in is a drug that is supposed to relieve knee pain. And so I give some people a pill that has my drug in it, and I'm going to give some other people a pill that's just really a sugar pill. It doesn't have any medicine or any drugs in it. Well, the control group in this scenario is going to be the people who got the sugar pill because that's no manipulation. The sugar pill doesn't do anything. And the experimental group is going to be the group that I'm interested in, is going to be the group that I manipulated. In other words, I gave them the drug. Now, in an experiment like the running shoes one, where I give some people Nikes and some people Fila's and some people Adidas, um, it's kind of hard to determine like which one is the manipulation there. Therefore, usually what the experimental group will be is the one that I'm interested in. And so since we decided that I work for Nike in this scenario, then Nike is going to be my experimental group. And Adidas and Fila's are part of my control group in this scenario. Because it just because I happen to be working for Nike, that's the group that I care about. The experimental group always gets the manipulation. Um, Now, once you have an experimental group and a control group and you run your experiment, then you compare the dependent variable or the results of the dependent variable for the experimental group to the results of the dependent variable to the control group. And you try to determine if your manipulation changed the frequency of the dependent variable. Um, if if you can demonstrate that statistically, that your experimental group was more affected than your control group or less affected than your control group, it could be go either way. And you quite likely have a causal relationship there. Now, sometimes students will ask, what is the point of having these two groups? And the answer is that without comparison, there's no way to determine if the change in the dependent variable is related to the independent variable or if it's just kind of random. Let's say that I want to know if a drug for anxiety works. And so I just give my drug for anxiety to a bunch of people and then test whether or not their anxiety went down. And I get that, yeah, it did. And I go, well, how much did their anxiety go down? And I notice that it's 5% or something like that. Well, that doesn't mean anything to me, right? Would their anxiety have gone down just because they were sitting around anyway? Um, would it have gone down because they were relaxed, because they started thinking about something else? There's no way to determine that. But if I have a control group, all of a sudden I can determine that. Researchers will do their best to make sure that the experimental group and the control group are randomly selected so that whoever goes into each group is completely random. And that sort of helps out to make the groups as equal as possible. But then, if the experimental group's anxiety goes down and about 5%, and the control group also goes down about 5%, well, then I know that my pill didn't do anything. They both went down just together. Um, there was no difference. But if I see that my experimental group went down in anxiety and my control group did not go down in anxiety, then I know now that my independent variable did affect the dependent variable. There's another reason why we split these up, and that's we sometimes call it the placebo effect. In the placebo effect, if you believe that doing X is going to affect you in one way or another, a lot of times it does, right? Classic example is we all have a friend who loves magnets, right? And they'll tell you, when I have a headache, I put on my little magnet bracelet, and immediately I start to feel better. And they're not lying. That does work for some people because they believe it so much that, in fact, they create changes in their biology that have been tested that actually decreases their pain, for example. But if we put that to the test, if I take 100 people and split them up into two categories, an experimental group and a control group, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give my experimental group a magnet bracelet, and I'm going to give my control group the same bracelet, but I'm gonna secretly, I'll have taken out the magnets. And so it looks exactly like the other ones, except that this one doesn't actually have any magnets in it. And then I'll put them through the test and determine, how many of them have less pain, or how many of them report being happier, or whatever the case might be. And usually, when we do studies like that, what we determine is that there's no difference. Yeah, some people from the experimental group say, yeah, I have less pain, or yeah, I feel happier. But a lot of other people from the experimental group are going to come in and say, yeah, nothing changed. And what we're going to see when we compare that to the control group, some people from the control group are going to say, yeah, I feel like I got happier, or I feel like I have less pain. And the rest of them are going to say, nah, I that didn't do anything for me, right? And when I compare the difference, I'm going to see that there is really no difference statistically between my experimental group and my control group. And now I know that, in fact, that magnet bracelets don't help with pain or happiness or anything really. They're very fashionable, some of them, but besides that, they're not going to help with anything else. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. And remember that the best way to contact me is directly through Canvas. I hope to hear from you soon.